She stood there in her wedding dress, not out of love, but out of duty. The man beside her, a brilliant surgeon with a heart colder than the steel of his scalpel, barely looked at her. They said it was fate, but fate didn't tell her what was coming next. This opening immediately draws your audience into the story, evoking curiosity and emotion. You can pause after what was coming next to build suspense. She was never supposed to end up in that wedding hall. Not that day, not with that man. Yet there she stood, a vision of grace, wrapped in layers of silk and silence. The golden bangles on her wrists clinked with every nervous breath, echoing like distant bells of surrender. Around her, guests smiled and whispered, praising the match. To them, it was perfect, a wealthy, respected doctor marrying a gentle, obedient woman. But beneath her painted smile, her heart trembled with the weight of decisions made by others. The words, "for your own good," had been repeated so many times that she had almost started to believe them. Almost. Her story began not with love, but with expectations. In her family, marriage was never about hearts meeting, it was about reputations aligning. Her father had worked his whole life to build respect in their small community. Her mother, shaped by tradition, believed that a daughter's honor rested in the husband she secured. And when the proposal came from the renowned doctor, Armin, a man whose name carried prestige and promise, her parents' eyes gleamed with pride. She had protested quietly, her voice trembling like a candle in the wind. "I don't know him," she had whispered. But her mother's gentle but firm reply silenced her. "You will learn to love him, dear. Love comes after marriage, not before." In the days that followed, preparations consumed her home. Every corner buzzed with excitement, yet she felt like a guest in her own story. Tailors took her measurements while she stared at her reflection, trying to recognize the woman in the mirror. Her friends teased her about her luck, but all she could think about was the silence that would follow when the music faded. She had always dreamed of marrying for love, of finding someone who saw her for who she truly was, not just what she represented. But those dreams, delicate and soft, were folded neatly away, hidden beneath the weight of duty and fear of disappointing her family. The first time she met Armin, he was polite but detached. His words were precise, his smile practiced, his gaze clinical, as if he were examining a patient rather than meeting his future wife. He asked few questions, offered fewer compliments, and spoke mostly about his hospital, his schedule, his ambitions. She listened quietly, nodding at the right times, her heart sinking deeper with every sentence. In his presence, she felt invisible, not because he ignored her, but because he didn't seem to notice there was anything **C beyond her appearance and her family name. When their meeting ended, he shook her hand like a business partner closing a deal. That handshake sealed her future. On the wedding day, the air was heavy with celebration, but her mind was elsewhere. She remembered her childhood, the way she used to run barefoot through the fields, laughing at the wind, dreaming of a life where she could make her own choices. Now, every step toward the stage felt like a betrayal of that young girl. The doctor stood beside her, perfectly composed, his expression unreadable. The photographer asked them to smile, and so she did, not for herself, but for the parents watching proudly from the front row. When the garlands were exchanged and the vows were spoken, she felt the finality of it sink in. The applause that followed sounded distant, muffled, like the world was celebrating a victory she hadn't wanted to win. Their home was beautiful, cold, and immaculate, much like him. Every object seemed to reflect his personality, organized, precise, untouched by warmth. The walls held degrees and awards, but not a single picture of joy. He worked long hours, and when he was home, silence filled the spaces between them like fog. He spoke little, and when he did, his tone carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. She tried to reach out at first, setting his table, waiting up for him, asking about his day, but each effort was met with indifference or impatience. To him, marriage seemed like another task checked off a long list of responsibilities. To her, it was a sentence she hadn't deserved, and yet, even in that isolation, she tried to find meaning. She told herself that perhaps this was what marriage was supposed to be, that love would grow slowly, that respect would bloom in time. But deep inside, she knew something was missing. She missed laughter. She missed being seen. She missed herself. Each night, as she lay beside a man who never really looked at her, she wondered if this was what every woman before her had silently endured, the quiet surrender dressed up as tradition, the sacrifice disguised as duty. She had been forced to marry an arrogant doctor, but she had no idea that this unwanted union would become the turning point of her entire life. Dr. Arman was a man of precision, the kind of man whose world revolved around control, calculation, and success. In his hospital, people revered him. Patients saw him as a savior, nurses as a perfectionist, and junior doctors as an unapproachable idol. Every movement of his hand carried the confidence of someone who believed he could not be wrong. But at home, that same precision became suffocating. He lived by the clock, by lists, by discipline, and he expected the same from her. Breakfast had to be served at 7, dinner at 9, conversations kept short and formal. To him, order was a virtue. To her, it was a cage built from invisible walls. He rarely raised his voice, but his silence carried weight. When he was displeased, he didn't shout. He simply looked that cold, judging look that could shrink her spirit without a single word spoken. When she asked simple questions, his answers came clipped, as though she were interrupting something far more important. If she tried to share her thoughts, he dismissed them with a distant "not now." It wasn't cruelty in the physical sense. It was emotional neglect, the slow erosion of warmth. He didn't see her pain because he didn't think he needed to. After all, in his mind, he had provided her everything: comfort, a home, respect. What more could she possibly want? To the outside world, he was the perfect husband. He made sure her needs were met, that she never had to worry about money, that she looked well taken care of in public. But no one saw how lonely she was in that perfect house. No one saw how her laughter had faded into a polite smile. He would come home after long hours at the hospital, drop his briefcase on the table, and immediately begin reviewing medical reports. Sometimes she would wait by the window just to say good night, but he'd fall asleep before she could utter a word. The arrogance of his profession had seeped into his soul. He believed that saving lives in the operating room made him invincible in every other part of life. Compassion, in his mind, was for patients, not partners. There were moments when his arrogance turned subtle but sharp, like a blade made of words. Once she overcooked a dish and apologized softly. He didn't shout. Instead, he said, "You should learn to focus, it's not that hard." It wasn't the comment itself, but the tone: dismissive, belittling, final. She stood there, hands trembling, realizing it wasn't about the food at all. It was about control. He needed perfection from everyone around him because he demanded it from himself. He couldn't tolerate mistakes, not in the operating room, and not in his wife. What he didn't see was that life outside a hospital isn't meant to be flawless. It's meant to be felt. She began to notice how his arrogance followed him like a shadow. Even with his colleagues, he spoke as though his opinion were law. When others offered suggestions, he listened only long enough to prove them wrong. He was admired but not loved, respected but not understood. She often wondered if he even knew how to be vulnerable, if he had ever allowed anyone to see the man behind the title. And yet, every time he spoke about his work, there was a strange light in his eyes, a passion that belonged to the boy he once was before the world demanded perfection of him. She caught glimpses of that boy sometimes, buried deep under layers of pride, and something inside her whispered that maybe he wasn't heartless, just lost. The more she tried to understand him, the more she realized that arrogance is often fear in disguise. His pride was armor, not cruelty. It shielded him from failure, from emotion, from the haunting memories that lingered behind his steady gaze. She began to wonder what had made him so distant, what pain he was hiding behind his flawless facade. But he never let her close enough to find out. And so, night after night, they lived side by side like strangers, two souls under one roof, divided by silence. She had been forced into marriage with an arrogant doctor, and now she was beginning to see that arrogance wasn't his nature, it was his wound. There comes a moment in every storm when silence breaks, when even the calmest heart finally screams to be heard. For her, that moment arrived quietly, like a whisper that grew too heavy to contain. She had endured months of indifference, months of trying to please a man who treated affection like a luxury he could not afford to give. At first, she told herself it was just his nature, that he was too busy, too tired, too burdened. But slowly, she began to see that the real reason was far more painful. He simply didn't care to see her. And when you live in a house where your existence goes unnoticed, even breathing begins to feel like a rebellion. It started with little things, the way he ignored her when she spoke, the way his eyes stayed fixed on his phone when she tried to talk about her day. One evening, she prepared his favorite meal, hoping it might melt the ice between them. She waited as he came home, weary from work, and smiled as he sat down. "How was your day?" she asked softly. He didn't answer. He barely looked up. Minutes later, he muttered, "Salt's a little too much," and went back to scrolling through his phone. That night, she didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because the pain had grown so familiar it no longer demanded tears. It was the quiet kind of suffering, the kind that settles into your bones and teaches you how to disappear without dying. The breaking point didn't come in a burst of anger. It came in stillness. One morning, she looked at herself in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes were dim, her voice hesitant, her smile faint. The version of her who once dreamed, laughed, and loved freely was gone, replaced by someone who existed only to maintain peace in a war she never declared. She realized she had been walking on eggshells for so long that she no longer knew how to stand tall. And that realization, that quiet acknowledgement of what she had become, was the first crack in the shell that had trapped her for too long. One evening, as rain poured outside, she sat on the balcony, watching the sky weep the tears she couldn't. Armin came home late, drenched in frustration after a surgery that hadn't gone as planned. Without a word, he threw his coat aside and began pacing. "They don't listen," he snapped, more to himself than to her. "I tell them what to do, but they always think they know better." His voice was sharp, his anger aimed at no one and everyone. For the first time, she didn't shrink away. She simply looked at him, really looked at him, and said softly, "Not everyone you lead is meant to obey you." The room fell silent. He turned to her, surprised, as if the furniture had just spoken. It was the first time she had ever challenged him, and in her calmness there was a power he hadn't seen before. That night, she didn't sleep. Her words replayed in her mind, not out of fear, but awakening. For months, she had let his arrogance define her worth, his moods dictate her peace, but no more. Something within her had shifted, a quiet defiance, a fragile flame of self-respect that refused to go out. She began to write again, little notes, poems, thoughts, the kind of things she used to create before her marriage. Each word felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that she had buried under compromise. She didn't hate him, she pitied him, because in his world of control and pride, he had lost the ability to feel something she was just beginning to rediscover. But the universe has a strange way of testing strength the moment it awakens. Just when she started to breathe again, life threw her a moment that changed everything. One evening, as Armin prepared for yet another surgery, he snapped at her for misplacing his files. The words he used weren't cruel, but they carried the same cutting tone. "Can't you do anything right?" he said, and something inside her broke, not her heart, but her silence. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling yet strong. I can live without your approval." She walked away before he could respond. For the first time, he watched her leave, and for the first time, he felt the sting of being unseen. What she didn't know then was that this single act of courage, this moment of quiet rebellion, would mark the beginning of a transformation neither of them had imagined. Days turned into weeks, and their fragile peace was balanced on silence. After that small rebellion, something had shifted not just in her, but in him too. Armin was unsettled. For the first time, his authority had been questioned, not in the hospital, but in his own home. Yet what disturbed him wasn't her defiance, it was the reflection it forced him to see. Her calm strength exposed something in him that he had spent years burying. The boy who once dreamed freely before pride became his armor. That night he lay awake long after she fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, haunted not by her words, but by the truth they carried. Not everyone you lead is meant to obey you. It echoed in his mind like an unfinished diagnosis. The following days brought subtle changes. He began to watch her more closely, not with affection, but curiosity. She moved differently now, with a quiet confidence that both intrigued and unnerved him. She had stopped trying to please him, stopped waiting for his approval, and in that detachment, she appeared stronger than ever. For the first time, he noticed the way she hummed softly while doing chores, how she would spend hours reading by the window, lost in a world he couldn't touch. She was no longer the timid wife he could control. She had become something unpredictable, and in a way, he respected that. Though he would never admit it, he missed her attention, her constant effort to win him over. His arrogance had built a fortress, but her silence was the first crack in its walls. One night, after a grueling day at the hospital, Armin returned home visibly exhausted. His usually composed face was pale, his shoulders slumped, his hands trembling slightly. She asked if he was all right, and for the first time, he didn't brush her off. A patient didn't make it. He murmured, his voice breaking. The words hung heavy in the air. She froze, surprised not by his grief, but by the fact that he had shared it. It was the first real emotion she had seen from him since their marriage. Without saying a word, she poured him a glass of water and sat beside him. No questions, no advice, just presence. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence wasn't cold this time. It was human, fragile, almost sacred. In that moment, the mask he had worn for so long slipped, and she glimpsed the man beneath the arrogance, a man haunted by failure, burdened by expectations, desperate to appear unbreakable. From that night on, she began to see him differently. Armin's arrogance, she realized, wasn't born from cruelty, it was a shield. He had built it to survive a world that demanded perfection from him. Every life he couldn't save became a wound he hid behind superiority. Every emotion he suppressed was a scar buried under layers of control. His pride wasn't just about power. It was about fear of being seen as weak, fear of losing respect, fear of disappointing the world that worshipped him. And though she had every reason to hate him, she found herself understanding him instead. That empathy wasn't forgiveness, it was clarity. She began to see that sometimes even the most arrogant souls are simply the most afraid to feel. But understanding him didn't mean surrendering again. She drew her boundaries firmly, quietly. When he snapped out of habit, she no longer shrank, she simply walked away. When he dismissed her, she didn't argue, she smiled and carried on. Her composure disarmed him more than any outburst ever could. He started to notice the emptiness his pride had created not just in their marriage, but within himself. He would find her writing late at night, her face glowing softly in the lamplight, and something inside him stirred jealousy, admiration, maybe even regret. He realized that while he had spent his life mastering medicine, she had mastered resilience. She had found healing without a prescription, peace without his permission. Then came the night everything changed between them. A storm raged outside, thunder echoing through their empty home. He returned late, soaked and defeated, having lost another patient despite his best efforts. She found him sitting on the floor, his hands covering his face, a man stripped of his pride, broken by the very perfection he worshipped. Without thinking, she sat beside him and whispered, "You can't save everyone, Armin." He didn't look up. "Then what am I?" he asked, his voice cracking. "If I can't fix what's broken, what am I?" And for the first time since their marriage began, she reached for his hand. "Human," she said simply. That one word pierced deeper than any lecture could. In that moment, he realized that love, the thing he had dismissed as weakness, was the only thing strong enough to heal him. After that night, something shifted permanently between them. The walls he had built began to crumble, not all at once, but piece by piece. He still struggled, still stumbled, but now there was a softness in him that hadn't existed before. He began to thank her for little things, to ask questions, to listen. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a beginning. And as she watched this transformation unfold, she understood something profound, that sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones most in need of compassion. She had been forced to marry an arrogant doctor, but she was slowly discovering that beneath the arrogance lay a heart that had forgotten how to beat freely. Change, once it begins, does not announce itself, it seeps quietly into the spaces between people. For her, it came not as a grand revelation, but as a slow awakening. Living beside a man who had once dismissed her, she discovered that strength was not measured in how loud one spoke, but in how deeply one could endure without losing oneself. Compassion, she learned, was not weakness. It was the power to see pain beneath pride, to recognize humanity in someone who had forgotten his own. She had spent months rebuilding herself from the fragments of neglect, and now every act of kindness she offered came not from submission, but from choice. She was no longer the woman who tried to earn love. She was the woman who chose to give it freely, on her terms. Her compassion became his mirror. Armin, who had built his life around command and control, now found himself disarmed by her gentleness. When he snapped, she didn't retaliate. She paused, looked him in the eye, and said softly, "You don't have to win every conversation." When he retreated into silence, she didn't chase after him anymore. Instead, she let the quiet linger, trusting that truth would reach him eventually. That quiet confidence unsettled him more than any argument ever could. He began to notice that she no longer feared him. Her calm was no longer submission, it was sovereignty. The balance of their relationship had shifted, and for the first time, he was no longer the center of her world. She was. In the hospital, Armin's colleagues began to see a subtle change in him. The impatient surgeon started listening more, even asking for opinions. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. He began to realize that leadership didn't mean domination, it meant understanding. At home, he started asking small questions. Did you eat? How was your day? Simple words, but for her, they carried the weight of miracles. She responded not with excitement, but with quiet gratitude. She didn't need him to transform overnight. She only needed him to try. Every step he took toward humility reflected her silent influence, her strength wrapped in tenderness. It wasn't love in its grandest form yet, but it was something purer, respect. Her own transformation deepened. She no longer sought validation in his moods. She began volunteering at a nearby shelter, using her time to help others who felt unseen. Through their stories, she recognized fragments of her own women who had been silenced, men who had lost their way, families torn by pride. She spoke softly but with conviction, reminding them that kindness is not the opposite of power. It is the highest form of it. The act of helping others reignited her purpose. Each day, she spent their added color back into her life, and when she returned home, Armin noticed it too. He didn't understand it at first, how someone could grow stronger by giving so much away, but deep inside, he admired her for it. One evening, as she prepared tea, Armin approached her hesitantly. "You're different," he said, almost whispering. She smiled faintly. "Maybe I just stopped being afraid." He looked at her for a long moment, realizing that he wasn't the only one who had changed. She had too, but in ways he couldn't comprehend. She had transformed her pain into grace, her silence into wisdom. Her power didn't come from control. It came from compassion, the kind that heals without demanding anything in return. And for the first time in his life, Armin felt something unfamiliar. Admiration not born from success, but from humility. Their home began to feel lighter, as though the shadows that had long haunted their marriage were finally lifting. He started to laugh awkwardly at first, then more freely. She joined him, her laughter soft but real. echoing through the walls that had once held only silence. They shared meals without tension, conversations without judgment, and though their relationship was far from perfect, it was human, raw, honest, alive. She knew he might falter again. He was, after all, still learning how to be whole. But she also knew that compassion had changed them both in ways that anger never could. What began as a forced union was slowly becoming something neither of them had expected, not a love story written by fate, but one rewritten by choice. And so, she continued to move forward not as a woman trapped by duty, but as one guided by purpose. She had faced arrogance with patience, cruelty with grace, and in doing so, discovered a truth far greater than survival. Compassion, she realized, is not about soft hearts or forgiving too easily. It's about having the courage to stay kind in a world that teaches you to harden. She had learned to stand tall without raising her voice, to lead without commanding, and to love without losing herself. What she didn't yet know was that this newfound strength, the quiet, luminous kind that changes others by simply existing, was about to transform her story in ways she could never have imagined. Life has a strange way of completing the circles we never knew we were drawing. What began as a forced marriage between two strangers had transformed into something neither of them could have imagined. Yet even as peace slowly settled into their home, the world had one more test waiting, a moment that would reveal how far both had come. One evening, Armin received a call from the hospital. An emergency, a young patient in critical condition. He rushed out, his expression tense but focused. She watched him leave, her heart calm but heavy. In the past, she would have worried about his anger, his temper if things went wrong. But now, she simply whispered, "Do your best," and knew he would hear her strength even in her silence. Hours later, she awoke to the sound of the door opening. He entered quietly, exhaustion written across his face. For a moment, she feared the worst. But then he looked up, his eyes glistening, and said, "She made it." Relief washed over her. She walked up to him and placed a hand on his arm, a gesture so simple. Yet it spoke volumes of how far they had come. He didn't say much more, but in his eyes there was gratitude, not pride. For the first time, he looked at her not as a wife given to him, but as a woman who had stood beside him through every storm, silent yet unshakable. The arrogant doctor she once knew was gone. In his place stood a man humbled by love, softened by the quiet power of compassion. As days turned into months, their lives began to intertwine in ways that felt natural, effortless. He started leaving small notes before heading to work, reminders, apologies, sometimes even jokes. She found herself smiling again, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. They began sharing breakfast together. Something that had once been a formality now felt like a ritual of connection. On weekends, he accompanied her to the shelter where she volunteered. Watching her interact with others, seeing how she listened and comforted, reminded him of what true healing looked like. "You're good at this," he told her once. She smiled and replied, "So are you, when you remember that healing isn't just about medicine." That line stayed with him, simple yet transformative. Their bond deepened not because of grand gestures, but through small, everyday moments. The way he helped her water the plants, the way she made his favorite tea without being asked, the way they sat in comfortable silence after long days. Love, she realized, wasn't about fireworks or confessions. It was about showing up, consistently, quietly. The man who had once dismissed her emotions now listened to her stories with genuine curiosity. The woman who had once feared speaking now spoke with certainty, knowing her words mattered. They were not perfect, but they were learning together how to forgive, how to rebuild, how to live with open hearts. One afternoon, as they sat watching the sunset from their balcony, Armin broke the silence. "I was wrong about love," he said softly. "I thought it was something that distracted people from success. But now I see it's the only thing that makes success worth having." She turned to him, her expression gentle but firm. "Love doesn't make you weaker, Armin. It just reminds you that strength without compassion is empty." He nodded, his gaze lost in the fading light. That moment was not dramatic, but it was profound. It was the kind of understanding that comes only after breaking, healing, and beginning again. And yet, despite the calm they had found, she often thought back to how it all began that day when she was forced into marriage with a man she barely knew. How terrified she had been, how invisible she had felt, and how far she had come since then. She had entered his life as someone powerless, but now she stood beside him as his equal. Her journey had not been about taming his arrogance, but about reclaiming her own voice. Through pain, she had found purpose. Through endurance, she had discovered strength. And through compassion, she had transformed not only his life but her own. She never imagined that a marriage built on obligation would teach her the truest meaning of love, not the kind sung in stories or written in poems, but the quiet, resilient kind that grows from understanding and patience. She never imagined that the arrogant doctor who once looked down on her would one day look at her with reverence. And she never imagined that the woman who once feared losing herself would become the very force that helped another rediscover his humanity. Sometimes, life does not give us what we want, it gives us what we need to become who we are meant to be. And as she looked at the man beside her, she finally understood. She had never been forced into this story. She had rewritten it. As she stood by the window one quiet morning, sunlight spilling across the floor, she thought about the path that had brought her here. The woman she had once been frightened, uncertain, voiceless was gone. In her place stood someone shaped by endurance, by courage, by the gentle fire of compassion. She had entered a marriage without choice, but she had found her freedom within it. And that freedom was not about leaving or rebelling. It was about transforming pain into strength and silence into self-respect. Armin stepped beside her, holding 2 cups of tea. Their fingers brushed as he handed her one, and for the first time there was no awkwardness, no pride, only understanding. They didn't need words anymore. The journey between them had said everything. He had learned humility from her quiet strength, and she had learned forgiveness from his effort to change. They had not just survived their story, they had rewritten it together, line by line, choice by choice. She turned to him and smiled, a soft, knowing smile that carried the weight of everything they had endured. "Funny," she said, "how the things we never wanted sometimes give us exactly what we needed." He looked at her, eyes filled with a gratitude he could never quite express. "And sometimes," he replied, "the people we least deserve teach us how to deserve love." Outside, the world went on, children's laughter in the street, the hum of life moving forward. But for them, time felt still, suspended in peace. She leaned against the railing, sipping her tea, no longer the woman who had been forced into anything. She was the woman who had chosen to rise, to heal, to love, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. And as the morning light grew warmer, she realized that she didn't just survive an arrogant doctor's world, she had healed it. Not with submission, but with strength. Not with obedience, but with grace. Her story was no longer about being forced into a marriage. It was about discovering that love, in its truest form, is not given, it is earned. And she had earned it, every beautiful, painful, breathtaking piece of it.